All right, hello everyone again. So for our next talk, we have Kevin from Gitcoin speaking about DAOs, and this is Kevin's first public speaking appearance since he rejoined Gitcoin. So you guys are in for a special treat. All right, let's give it up for Kevin.
All right, hello everyone. How are we doing? All right, a little liveliness from the audience. My talk is entitled DAO Coordination, the Final Meta. So basically, coordination is what you do whenever you want to solve a coordination failure. Whenever a group of humans want to solve for a shared goal, then they coordinate. And meta is the most effective tactic available. So we're going to be talking about how we can rewrite the way that groups of humans coordinate and what the most effective tactic available for doing so is today. I'm Kevin from Gitcoin. Give me a snap if you've ever heard of Gitcoin. All right, we're coordinating. It's a signal generation mechanism. And I also run a podcast called The Green Pill Podcast, which is all about different ways crypto can be pro-social. Can I get a snap if anyone has listened to The Green Pill Podcast? All right, a little less people, but we're still building the movement. It's okay. Crypto can be good for the world. Thanks, Sam Bankman-Fried, for making everyone think it's not possible. All right, so the gist of this talk is going to be about exporting coordination technology to the world. So basically, we have Ethereum, which is programmable money. We program our values into our money. We can build web-scale coordination mechanisms for the world. The first thing we're going to do with this technology is fund the public goods, fund the open source software, the things that we all derive value from in the Ethereum ecosystem. And then from there, how can we channel that momentum into our digital public goods, things like open source software that create $400 billion per year in economic value for the world, but there is no business model to work on them, so you have to go work for JP Chase if you're a software developer in Web 2 instead of working on open source software. Hope there's no one from JP Morgan here. Gave this talk at Consensus, and there's like a guy in the front row who is from JP Morgan. All right, so there are internet public goods, which is, just like all of the digital public goods out there, and it is a coordination failure that we cannot solve the ability to fund digital ecosystems without surveillance capitalism, without advertising, and without creating social media environments that destroy democracies, because all we can do is push out rage bait and things that trigger dopamine rushes in the world. And then there's just all of knowledge, which is an example of a worldwide public good. Things that the outer ring of the momentum that we're going to create is exporting more coordination to all of these things in the world. And just because of our digital skills and because of Ethereum, because it has a multi-billion-dollar market cap, we can generate momentum and we can cross the chasm into funding the world's public goods from there. And that what this talk is going to sort of lay out a vision for how we can do that. So I'm going to start with the evolving meta of the Ethereum ecosystem, and we're going to talk about scaling this coordination meta into the mainstream, and then we're going to close with a little special treat. All right. Oh my gosh, get ready to step into my brain on this one. Okay, so what we're looking at here is an evolutionary tree of the Web3 ecosystem. So the way you read this is from inside out. The Byzantine generals problem was solved in 2008 by an individual or a group of individuals named Satoshi Nakamoto, and that gave birth to the Bitcoin ecosystem. And there's been, every couple years, a bull-bear cycle. Each of these rings right here is a bear market, in which, in the bull markets, the ecosystem expands 10 to 1,000x. And in the bear markets, it declines 5 to 500x. And so we have this sort of bull-bear cycle, this evolutionary cycle, in which the Bitcoin ecosystem has been ebbing and flowing between bearish and bullishness. And then over the years, we've gotten things like Mt. Gox, which grew in the bull market and then imploded in the bear market. And then we've got a whole ecosystem of centralized exchanges that have been built out of Bitcoin over the last couple years. So this orange layer of the evolutionary tree is the evolution of the Bitcoin ecosystem. And then adjacent to it, there is the Bitcoin forks. So basically Bitcoin Cash, Litecoin, Zcash, Dogecoin. The meta in this part of the ecosystem was just to fork Bitcoin and to make it more light, make it more Doge affiliated. And so there was the evolution of the whole Bitcoin ecosystem, then adjacent to it was the Bitcoin forks. And then the next rung over is Ethereum and the Ethereum forks. So basically Ethereum Classic, Ethereum, the main fork, Avalanche, Binance Coin. And then as the bull and bear cycle happens, we start to see things like EIP 1559 in the merge in the outer rings of this evolutionary tree. We start to see the propagation of early DAOs. I'll tweet this later so you don't have to have a low-res picture on your phone. So there's an extinction event right here with the DAO. And the thing I think is really incredible about the DAO, if you were around in the ecosystem, is at times they really dreamed big. They were saying, how can we allocate capital together? And it was the implosion of the DAO, the extinction of the event of that DAO, that we got early DAOs. Things like Moloch DAO and MakerDAO rose from the ashes of the extinction event of the DAO and formed the foundation of the DAO ecosystem that we know today. Oh man, stablecoins, ICOs. See this big extinction event after ICOs. EOS, Salt, Kin. Is anyone using Dentacoin to pay their dentists these days? DeFi, DAOs, YAM V1, I would say, is sort of an extinction event. Vegetable forks were part of the meta last cycle. Oh my gosh. We were all farming digital vegetables at about this time last cycle. Wallets, new dev tools, alt layer 1s, bridges, ETH layer 2s, NFTs, DAOs, DAO tooling, Regen Web 3, of which I would count myself to be a part of, and then play to earn. So this all started with the Byzantine generals problem and our ability to now send value across a computer network. And that triggered this evolutionary cycle in the Web3 ecosystem that ebbed and flowed between the bull and the bear of the ecosystem. And it was not through natural selection through which the ecosystem evolved, it was through market selection, okay? All right, so I think what's really interesting about this is that the meta evolved each cycle. If you were in crypto in 2011, basically all you had to do was fork Bitcoin and add a dog to it, or add a lightness to it. Always made me upset that Charlie Lee calls himself Satoshi Light. Yeah, you fucking copy-pasted Litecoin, and like, congratulations. All right, so the meta evolves each cycle, and in the early days, you just had to fork Bitcoin and add something to it. Vitalik did that, but he added general purpose programmability to it. That spawned a whole ecosystem of DAOs. Anything you could program your value into your money with in the Ethereum ecosystem kind of became a meta. Digital organizations, faster transactions, more pro-social dApps I would consider the Regen Web 3 ecosystem to be. And so what I think is interesting is that the meta, the most effective tactic available, has been evolving each cycle ever since the beginning. And it never stays the same. The meta is always changing because this is such a chaotic industry. And it's the people who can figure out the next meta, I think, are going to be the ones that are defining our future. And I mean, this is just like maybe the hippy-dippy in me, but like I'd like to make an analogy between natural systems and digital systems in that the cancers and the viruses in this ecosystem, the 3ACs and the FTXs, are degenerative. Degenerative means resource capacity goes down over time. Degenerative systems are self-terminating. The DAO, Dentacoin, ICOs that didn't follow through, they're degenerating. And it's going to be the projects that are regenerating, that are growing over time, that are going to be the ones that are going to define the next cycle. You want to build the keystone species of these regenerative ecosystems. You want to build the species upon which every other species depends. Ethereum is a great example of that. Bitcoin's a great example of that. MakerDAO and DAI is an example of that. I would personally like for one day to be said that Gitcoin is a keystone species of the regenerative ecosystem. Okay, so the meta of the Web3 ecosystem has been evolving and ebbing and flowing over the last 10 years. And yes, there's been this bull-bear cycle over the last 10 years. We've also had a historically low-rate environment from 2011 to 2022. But it went from Bitcoin forks to Ethereum forks to ICOs to veggie coins to meme coin. I think meme coins are probably evergreen because it's the internet. To PFP projects to loot. Does anyone have loot for adventurers in the audience? Couple hands, and then other people who aren't paying attention or are too ashamed to say that they still have loot. Ohm forks. You remember Ohm forks? Metaverse. Everyone, we talked about in the last panel, the metaverse. DAOs, AI coins, layer 2s, and now we're all the way over at the end of this ebb and flow. We're friend tech. We're financializing our friends, and that's the meta right now. So all of these ecosystems, in order to survive, are going to need to regenerate instead of degenerate. And the crux of my talk, if you don't remember anything from my talk, it's that funding your ecosystem's public goods is a sustainable competitive advantage. It is the final meta. Underneath of financializing your friends or building a layer 2 or building a PFP project or building loot for adventurers, you are going to need to fund your ecosystem's coordination. You are going to need to coordinate around your coordination failures in order to solve those problems. So ecosystem public goods, and by the way, to me, solving coordination failures and public goods are just the same thing. Public goods are one of the biggest coordination failures out there. And one of the biggest promises I think I see for crypto is the ability to solve for how do you create Byzantine fault tolerance in a digital system with the validator network that is Ethereum. But other public goods in ecosystems that aren't cryptographically provable are things like roadmaps. I think Vitalik does a great job of, hey, here's the merge, the splurge, the verge, I don't know, I'm making up adjectives at this point, but the fact that he's kind of memeified the Ethereum roadmap, I think, is a public good for the Ethereum ecosystem. Synthesizing feedback, building great software, getting that software adopted. I think one thing that DAOs are really are struggling with right now is governance apathy. How do we solve that? It's a public good for your ecosystem if you can solve that. But one of the through lines of this talk that I'm really excited about is how do we go from solving ecosystems public goods, where we're basically coordinating and prototyping new public goods funding technology, and how do we reach escape velocity so that we can solve our global coordination failures, things that aren't in the crypto ecosystem? How do we solve for open source funding? How do we solve for AI alignment? How do we solve for climate change? How do we solve for biodiversity collapse? How do we solve for the fact that in order to make any money in the Web 2 ecosystem, you have to surveil all of your users all the time? These things are deeply connected, and it is my belief that we can reach escape velocity in the crypto ecosystem with these mechanisms and funding sources, and we can cross the chasm to solving global coordination failures. After all, we are rewriting how society allocates capital to the things that it needs. All right, so a building block of this hypothesis is this thing called Holons. So basically a Holon is something that's simultaneously a whole in itself and also part of a larger whole. So I am a human, I'm the Holon of Kevin Owocki up here on stage. I'm also part of the Holon of this audience standing in this room. There's also an adjacent set of Holons that hopefully out there is my Twitter audience and is following along at home. If you were following along at home, thanks for tuning in. And then there's the Web3 ecosystem, and there's Austin, Texas, and then there's the national economy, and there's the global world, planet Earth. And so basically these Holons form something called a holarchy, okay? So a connection between Holons where each Holon is both a part and a whole of itself. So basically, you as a person are a member of a family, which is a member of your extended family, which at least in the olden times would have been part of a village and a community and would have been part of your local bioregional ecosystem. The digital ecosystem is a little bit more complicated than that, but that's an example of a holarchy. And one of the things that I really love about talking about Holons is that it breaks the duality between individualism and collectivism. So basically, as an individual, as a collective of individuals, we can break the duality between what is right for the individual, the things that you need, sovereignty, protection, and what is right for the group, democratic decision-making, capital allocation, and coordination versus defection. And there's a famous game theoretical example of this that I think really illustrates holonic coordination, and it's this example of a game theoretical setup called the prisoner's dilemma. Are people in the audience familiar with the prisoner's dilemma? Oh my gosh. I tried talking about this with some of my wife's friends the other day, and they were like, no one knew about the prisoner's dilemma. But I feel like it's foundational in this space. This is what we've solved with the Byzantine generals problem. This game theoretic setup is that a prisoner is interrogated in a separate room with another prisoner for an alleged crime that they had committed. And basically, they're both offered a deal where if each of them rat on the other person, then they get less time in prison. But if they stay silent, then they each get a little bit of time in prison, but not as much as if they rat on each other. And the whole point of the prisoner's dilemma is that without an ability to coordinate between the two of them, they'll almost always rat on each other. And so I think that this is like a funny toy example of what a coordination failure looks like. And whenever I'm listening to this, I'm like, oh, I would stay silent because I'm brave, and I wouldn't rat out my friend. And it's just like a funny toy example. But we'll all fly across the world, and we'll all externalize harm to our global ecosystem by creating carbon credits in order to advance our own agenda. We'll defect in order to create our own economic gains. And so like the toy example is just meant to illustrate that when there's a difference between the individual's needs and the collective needs, then a lot of times people will choose their own individual incentives absent a way to mutually enforce contracts to coordinate between the actors in the system. In Web3, we're building programmable, transparent, immutable commitments, and we can build coordination power tools. Our legacy institutions are opaque, unaccountable, inefficient, and often centralized, not to mention that they are built out of a nation-state infrastructure where you can only coordinate and trust other people in your nation-state, unless you're in a place in the world in which your nation-state agreements framework is expensive or is falling apart. Web3 provides a better coordination substrate, at least in theory. We can build transparent, uncorruptible, programmable, and permissionless coordination mechanisms using Web3. And it is on this foundation that I think that we can build better ways of allocating resources as a group and aligning the individual incentives with the collective, breaking the duality of the individual versus the collective. And I've seen it firsthand in my work at Gitcoin. So we have in the Ethereum ecosystem different ways of funding public goods. So basically donations, pre-mine, miner extractable value, taxes, if you consider block rewards to be taxes. And then we have distribution mechanisms, of which I think the most prominent are quadratic funding by Gitcoin and Optimism, retroactive public goods funding. There are other people that are experimenting with different ways to distribute these public goods. And what I think is really cool about this mutualistic and opt-in nature of these public goods funding mechanisms in the ecosystem is that you can stack them on top of each other. Quadratic funding is really great at creating a democratic capital allocation mechanism for your ecosystem, but you can just put it right next to retroactive public goods funding, which is really a little bit less democratic, but is also a way of bootstrapping a flywheel of public goods funding in your ecosystem. So these things stack next to each other. And it's in the market between these things that we're going to better learn to coordinate our ecosystem public goods. And we're going to create a market in which these mechanisms compete with each other, as opposed to the state where you're just stuck with this bureaucratic, inefficient way of allocating resources where you pay $500,000 for a toilet, or if you can even get the disclosure report of what was built. So this is what is the Ethereum ecosystem. We've got Optimism and retroactive public goods funding, which is delivering $20 million per quarter of public goods funding to the ecosystem. You've got DAO Drops, which is doing $250K per round. We've got Gitcoin, who's doing about $2 million per quarter and $50 million. in total in capital allocation. ClearFund, also a quadratic funding tool that's done $3 million. Giveth, I actually don't know Giveth's number, but I'm assuming that it's around $3 million. And then Protocol Guild, which is a self-curating registry that is funding Ethereum open source software developers. So we're stacking these things on top of each other, and we're prototyping a better way to allocate ecosystem public goods. And that, to me, is just a beautiful, beautiful thing. Because if we can find a way to prototype the best funding sources for public goods and mechanisms for public goods, and we can export Legos for anyone in the world to do it, then holy shit, we're going to cross that chasm from ecosystem public goods to the world's public goods by prototyping it in the Ethereum ecosystem and creating better coordination mechanisms. And one of the things that I think is really cool about this is that if the higher you go up in the Holons stack, like the more adversarial you get at like the nation state and city state level. You're in the kind of like a dark forest where anyone could rob you absent any sort of agreements that they're not going to steal from you. You have zero-sum games and you have a transactional mindset. But the more and more you start bootstrapping this culture of funding public goods, of karma, where impact equals profit, where value creation equals value capture, then you can build an ecosystem where your GDP is your power. This is what's so powerful about optimism and Gitcoin and all of these examples that I showed off, is that they're legitimately multi-million-dollar ecosystems. And so this isn't just some hippy-dippy theory. We're actually shipping something that people want, and that Holons GDP is its economic power. But within that, we're bootstrapping a teal culture, if anyone's familiar with spiral dynamics. We're bootstrapping positive-sum relationships between DAO constituents, and we're building this positive-sum, give-first mentality, give-first culture of where we're trying to have a bias towards action. So there's this loop between giving and receiving that's positive sum. If Ethereum is a dark forest, in the regen ecosystem, we are bootstrapping a positive sum ecosystem that is not a dark forest, where karmic loops happen. And by exporting that to the world, by building the GDP of that ecosystem, I think that's how the regen ecosystem wins. And one of the ways that I'm really excited about this happening is through DAO-to-DAO relationships. So if you are in a DAO and you want to do a relationship with another DAO, I think there's basically 3 layers to a DAO-to-DAO relationship. So basically at the social layer, it's like, hey, do we hang out and do we vibe together? Maybe an example of this is that Gitcoin and Radical have just been friends for years, 6 or 7 years. We've always been into trying to build this ecosystem in which we're funding open source software. Gitcoin happened to go in a direction where it was funding all public goods. Radical's still focused on open source software. And we've just been like, I have a picture with those guys from 2017 where we're just like sitting at a coffee table and we're planning how we can work together. And then there's the technological layer, which is basically how does our technology interop with each other? Gitcoin happens to be now exporting Gitcoin grants to the world. We've now got a credibly neutral protocol where anyone can put Gitcoin grants in their ecosystem. And so I guess to continue the Radical example, us using Radical drips in order to allocate funding to matching pools, and them using Gitcoin grants in order to fund their ecosystem public goods, getting the technology building blocks to work together. And then the third layer is economic interop. This is like, what are the funding that is flowed to each other? And the real put a ring on it version of this is if you're going to like do a token swap with each other. So Gitcoin and Radical have done that. Gitcoin holds a certain amount of RAD on their treasury balance, and Radical has a certain amount of GTC on their balance. So what are the ways in which we can build DAO-to-DAO relationships where we vibe on the social level, on the technological level, and the economic level? And if each of these DAO ecosystems is positive sum and is coordinating their own public goods, well, then you start to get in a really interesting spot in which we can build bridges between these 2 holonic ecosystems through thought leadering together and sponsorships and hanging out at the social layer, through technological integrations together, through doing token swaps or aqueducts of funding between each other. But don't just look at this as a one-to-one token relationship between these 2 DAOs. What happens when we start building a mesh network of DAOs that are all rising and falling together because they're all integrating at the social and technological and economic layer? We are starting to build a positive sum regenerative infrastructure for the entire Web3 ecosystem. And since these positive sum relationships and this coordination is helping to bootstrap a better meta in the Web3 ecosystem. And so what I think becomes really cool over time is as the top 100 or 500 DAOs in the Web3 ecosystem all start to have these relationships with each other, they rise and fall together by holding each other's tokens on balance sheet, by having technological integrations, and not just because they're all built in the Ethereum ecosystem, but many of them will be just by happenstance of their digital native ecosystem. So these millions of interdependent DAOs form the substrate through which we could build civilizational scale public goods one day. And that's what the remainder of my talk will be. I think I have about 10 minutes left, so I'll bring it home here. So You, as a person in the Web3 ecosystem, are a member of multiple interdependent Holons. This is me over here. This is you next to me inside of this Holon in which we're part of Permissionless. I also happen to be a part of the Ethereum ecosystem and Gitcoin DAO, and Gitcoin runs a conference called Shelling Point, which I would consider myself to be a member of. But there's intersectionality in these. Many of us are part of different Holons in which we are going to see a shift towards this culture of funding public goods. So if you look at it from a civilizational scale, you're going to see millions of interdependent DAOs. And then if you look at it from the perspective of yourself, you'll just see the DAOs that you're in your social group are intersected with. And one of the things that I'm really interested in is basically the holarchy, which again is just the stack of holons up and down the stack. So basically all the way from, if you look at like atoms and molecules and cells as holons, then up to people and families and local communities and cities and states like Austin, Texas, to the country, United States, to the planet. These are all holonic structures. And one of the things that's really beautiful to me is looking at the duality of individualism versus collectivism up and down the stack. And when you can connect in your mind the fact that cancer is just your cells defecting against your body, and climate change is just humans defecting against each other, and they're both creating degenerative systems at different holonic levels, holy fuck, this is like just like something materially part of the universe. All right, so that's the physical holarchy, and keep in mind that we're in the middle of multiple holarchies here. The other holarchy that I think is really important in the 21st century, in which we are bootstrapping information age public goods, is the digital public goods that we are a part of. So you're in a bunch of different social networks, you're in a bunch of different Telegram groups. If you're me, you're in too many of them. Discord groups, college friends, I play Ultimate Frisbee, if you couldn't tell. Open source software, Reddit communities, Twitter followers. So these are the digital ecosystems that we're in, the digital holons that we're in. And what it gets really interesting to me, when this really jumps the shark into the mainstream, is when we start cross-pollinating these mechanisms and money across the digital public goods realm and out of the Ethereum ecosystem into our geographic public goods. And what I think is really interesting is that when I wrote this talk, the crypto ecosystem has a $1-point-something trillion market cap. It's probably less today. And our physical ecosystem has trillions of dollars of capital available for public goods funding. So this is something that my friend Griff and Giveth have looked up, and basically if you add up all the NGO funding, all the social impact funding, and all of the government taxes in just like North America, you're getting into the tens of trillions of dollars per year. So this is probably one of the biggest markets that's out there, and we can build better mousetraps for public goods funding for coordination for the rest of the world. And this is something that we've been trying to prototype at Gitcoin by not just funding Ethereum infrastructure and Web3 infrastructure, but also starting to fund things like climate solutions through Gitcoin grants, and to fund things like supporting the humanitarian efforts in Ukraine. When COVID happened about 2 years ago, we were also funding 3D printers that were printing respirators for people. At the time, there was a shortage of respirators. Decentralized science, anti-surveillance technology, privacy is a public good. So it gets really interesting to me when we start to string together all of these different mechanisms of funding, and we start to distribute funding across all of these different mechanisms of public goods funding. One of the ideas that I'm really excited about that also interconnects all of these different things is aqueducts, which I guess basically in like ancient Rome were ways of carrying liquidity from where there was supply of it to where there's demand of it. I think there's going to be aqueducts in Web3 that are going to carry funding to Gitcoin and DAO drops and Protocol Guild and Optimism and ClearFund. This is an example, basic example of the aqueduct up on stage, up on the slides right here. But I think where it gets really interesting is when you start baking governance into these aqueducts. So basically, what are the ways in which we could use governance in order to solve, okay, this quarter it's more important that we focus on privacy technology and advocacy, but next quarter it might be some other public good. And so governance-weighted aqueducts in which you can just permissionlessly change the flow of the funding according to the democratic needs of the people that it serves is where it gets fun. And I think another area where it gets really fun is building composability into these aqueducts. So you can basically flow through 0x splits or through DAO drops these aqueducts into each other. And you can start to build these emergent superstructures that will fund public goods, both at the local scale and at the global scale. So basically the local scale builds legitimacy for the mechanisms. It helps people understand that crypto is not all just for NFTs and for speculation. Well, you know, imagine next cycle that people are earning for just having impact in their community as opposed to buying a PFP or buying a bag. And then at the global scale, by funding our digital public goods, we really hit a scale in which we're really building the biggest levers for supporting the world's public goods from there. This is one of my favorite slides, and it's one of the ones that, as I'm starting to close out, I want you to visualize the transition into a civilizational scale holonic structure for funding public goods. It's going to seem crazy in the year 2023. Probably seems a little bit crazy to you right now. But as it starts transitioning, and we're funding Ethereum public goods and all of open source software, we're going to be in transition to an end state in decades out in which we're going to be funding public goods for the whole world. And I kind of think of like Gitcoin is kind of like a gadfly right now for the ecosystem. It's like, oh, it's cute, like Kevin's funding public goods and Gitcoin's still alive just through sheer force of will of all of the people in their ecosystem. But like, we're gonna exhaust all of the pumps like lower in the stack around like layer 2s and decentralized messaging and meme coins, and we're gonna climb the stack of things that you need to build into the internet of value, and eventually there's gonna be like a cycle in which we're actually funding shit that's good for the world. Like, we'll climb that stack. So it seems crazy right now, but we can meme it into existence and we can articulate this vision of this holonic superstructure in which we're building a ecosystem that has roots that are all interconnected and are funding a forest of different organisms and animals and a regenerative ecosystem that is going to fund public goods. If anyone's seen the Netflix documentary Fantastic Fungi, there's this analogy oh, someone snapped there. I was like on a roll there. Mycelium networks. Who knows about mycelium networks? Basically, these fungal systems that transfer resources between the forest plants and the forest organisms. And I think that like that's kind of what the public goods funding ecosystem is out there. So going to end on a quick shill. Which is that I'm very happy to be back at Gitcoin. We have now achieved a status in which we've launched Gitcoin Grant Stack, which now anyone can use to run a quadratic funding round. Anyone can take what was working for the Ethereum ecosystem for Vitalik last cycle and can now deploy it in their own Holon, in their own EVM-based community. So if you're out there and you're interested in funding public goods because it's what's best for your community, but also you believe that coordination is the final meta, then you can just use Gitcoin grants and just like do it all as a service for you. So you can find out more at gitcoin.co/grantstack about Gitcoin grants. You can generate a signal of what your ecosystem really wants. This is the Gitcoin Grants Round 18 economic graph. Every node in this network is a user, and every edge is a transaction in the network. And so we're building a mesh network of interconnected people who are generating signal about which public goods they want to fund. It's not like how it works in Washington, where you just have some senator who's disconnected from their local environment deciding what the public goods funding are. We're building an emergent bottoms-up superstructure for how public goods are funding. Little alpha leak on what the next generation of Gitcoin is. The protocol underneath of Gitcoin grants is called Allo Protocol, which is the next generation capital allocation protocol. So quadratic funding is just the first app that we're building in the Gitcoin ecosystem. We are building quadratic voting. I hope to one day have assurance contracts, retroactive public goods funding, milestone-based payouts. And I believe that the future of capital allocation is peer-to-peer and massively multiplayer, and we are going to be building the mechanisms, the Swiss Army knife. If Gitcoin Grants 1.0 was a screwdriver with quadratic funding, it's now a Swiss Army knife of different capital allocation mechanisms. We were going to build the operating system for capital allocation in these DAOs. And so Allo Protocol, if you're a developer, come hit me up and we'll get you hooked up with an SDK. In closing, we are going to bootstrap a ecosystem of funding public goods for the Ethereum ecosystem, and that's going to help the Ethereum ecosystem win. We're going to use that to bootstrap funding of open source software, internet, and all world public goods. We're going to use this to cross the chasm from ecosystem public goods to global coordination failures. We're going to solve for all of the different public goods out there in the world, be they crypto, digital, global, nation state, city, or local. We're going to break the duality between individualism and collectivism. There is trillions of dollars in this market. There are dozens of mimetic tribes that are going to use this infrastructure in order to fund their public goods. And we are going to cross the chasm between digital and physical public goods. And that, my friends, is why DAO coordination is the final meta. Thank you so much.